So here we are again. We talked about dualism before in this session 14. We talked about materialism, monism. We talked about identity theory. We talked about eliminative materialism. So now comes another argument that is very commonly used. And this is the Mary's room argument. Or knowledge argument. It's an argument from 1982, originally in the philosophy of mind, and trying to make a point for dualism. And it's an argument against the identity theory of mind. But it's also particularly interesting for AI because you will see in a moment why this is interesting for AI. So the way the argument is put is a little strange and is unnecessarily inefficient. You could describe the argument a little better to make it better to understand. But let's do the following. Let's first read what the argument says. So Jackson in 1982 wrote the following. Mary is a brilliant scientist who, for whatever reason, is forced to investigate the world from a black and white room via a black and white television monitor. She specializes in the neurophysiology of vision and acquires, let us suppose, all the physical information there is to obtain about what goes on when we see ripe tomatoes or the sky, and when we use terms like red, blue, and so on. She discovers, for example, just which wavelength combinations from the sky stimulate the retina and exactly how this produces, via the central nervous system, the constant contraction of the vocal cords and expulsion of air from the lungs that results in the uttering of the sentence, "The sky is blue." What will happen when Mary is released from the black and white room or is given a color television monitor? Will she learn anything new or not? Okay, so let's get away from this original description. I don't particularly like it because it's somehow self-defeating. It says, Mary is sitting there in the room watching the world through a black and white TV. But, I mean, obviously, what if Mary looks at her hand? Her hand will not be black and white, right? So this description is a little strange. I think it is better to imagine that Mary is wearing, contact lenses that filter. She's wearing a mask, a kind of virtual reality headset. And she can only see through that, right? And now we have a similar situation where Mary can know everything there is to know about colors, but she can never see any color, right? So now the point is that Mary is a scientist who knows everything there is to know about the science of color, but has never experienced color. So this is the difference, right? She knows all the scientific facts, all of them, according to the premise of this argument, but she has never experienced any color. The question now is, once she experiences color, does she learn anything new? So will she be surprised to suddenly see, my red t-shirt? Will she say, oh, this is what red feels like? Or will she just look at it and say, yes, I knew that this is how red feels because I knew everything about color already. I hadn't seen it, but I knew everything about it. So Jackson claims that she does. Mary will look at my t-shirt and say, oh, this is what red feels like. So she's surprised. She learned something new she didn't know before. So the argument now is Mary, before her release, knows everything physical there is to know about other people. Mary, before her release, does not know everything there is to know about other people because she learned something about them on her release. Therefore, there are truths about other people which escape the physicalist story. In other words, there are truths about other people and herself which Mary does not know, and since she knows everything physical there is to know, there are truths that are not physical. And in this way, Jackson hopes to refute physicalism. Because if there are facts that are not physical, if there are experiences for Mary that are not physical, then not all our mental states are based on something physical, and then perhaps they don't need to be physical themselves. So then there can be things like consciousness, or like the qualia, right, the feeling of what it is to feel, right, that are not physical. And therefore then there is a little door in this physically closed universe to introduce something like a non-physical mind, and to introduce some form of dualism, right? So this is a dualist argument. If Mary learns something new, she learns something that is not physical, and therefore something non-physical exists that can be learned, and is related to the meta states of Mary, and then perhaps our mind is not physical to some extent. So now we can ask, okay, what is it exactly that Mary will learn that she didn't know before? And the answer is qualia. Qualia is a way to is just a word that means the way an experience feels to the subject of the experience. The way an experience feels to the subject of this experience. Looking at my t-shirt or looking at this light blue circle feels to you in a way. It feels different. The red t-shirt feels different to you than this feels to you when you look at it, right? Internally, you cannot communicate how it feels. You have no words except blue, light blue. This does not tell anybody how it feels. Light blue is a word, a label for this, but it does not actually describe the feeling. The feeling is strictly private. Qualia are private. It's something you know how it feels to you, but you never know how the same color, for example, feels to others, right? Other people might see my red t-shirt differently. If Mary now learns something new, it shows that qualia, the subjective qualitative properties of experiences, exist. If Mary gains something after she leaves the room, if she acquires knowledge of a particular thing she did not possess before, then that knowledge, Jackson argues, is knowledge of the qualia of seeing red, of this subjective experience of seeing red. Therefore, it must be considered that qualia are real properties, since there is a difference between a person who has access to a particular subjective feeling and one who does not. This comes from Wikipedia. Jackson argues that if Mary does learn something new upon experiencing color, then physicalism is false. Right? We said this already. Specifically, the knowledge argument is an attack on the physicalist claim about the completeness of physical explanations of mental states. I can explain mental states physically to some extent, but there are things like how this feels that cannot be explained physically. Mary may know everything about the science of color perception, but can she know what the experience of red is like if she has never seen red? And if we say no, then there is something mysterious, non-physical about this experience. Okay, so now, what counter-arguments do we have? Like everything in philosophy, right? Nobody agrees with anybody else, so we have counter-arguments to this argument. So the argument is, she learned something new, therefore physicalism is not a complete description of the world. Now, there are some counter-arguments. One is that there are two meanings of the word know. There is knowing that and knowing how. And these two are different in substantial way. There is pre-linguistic, pre-propositional knowledge from direct experience that cannot be expressed in words. It's easier to see this with smells, because we happen to have very, very limited vocabulary of smells. We have a much higher vocabulary, much better vocabulary describing optical experience and colors and shapes. But we have very little about smells. We can only say it smells good, it stinks, or it smells like something else. It smells like flowers, it smells like chocolate, but we cannot say what chocolate smells like, right? Except saying it smells like chocolate, which doesn't help. So we have no language for smells, almost no language, but we seem to have knowledge about smells. But is this really knowledge if it's not propositional? So the argument of Jackson seems to be based on confusing the two types of knowledge. In the premise, Mary knows that all that is to know. She has all the propositions. In the conclusion, Mary learns how something new. She doesn't learn any new fact about the world. She learns a new feeling about the world that is pre-linguistic. The argument, therefore, is perhaps not conclusive, right? Because it uses two different meanings of knowing, and this is a fallacy, right? An equivocation. You have two different meanings of knowing and you confuse them. There's another counter-argument. If Mary already knows everything that is to know about color, she would also know how red feels like. There is no mysterious qualia left over to explain. It's another possibility you can attack this argument, right? You could say, actually the conclusion is wrong. Mary will not, or Jackson's intuition is wrong. Mary will not learn anything new by looking at my t-shirt. She will know how it looks like. She will not be surprised because she knows everything that is to know about color, and this includes how color feels as a subjective experience, right? Again, these things are impossible to prove one way or the other. You can have an intuition, you can have a feeling about it, but you cannot really prove or disprove this knowledge argument. And so it's just interesting to think about it, and it's also interesting later to say that perhaps consciousness is similar, right? Consciousness is normally perceived as connected with this thing of Mary's room, because what does it mean to be conscious? It means to have qualia, right? It means to have subjective experience, and this is what makes me different from this camera. This camera also can see me perfectly right now, here I am, but the camera doesn't have a subjective experience, while I have a subjective experience of what it is to see the camera. And so the camera in my mind is represented in a particular way, while I am not represented in the camera's mind because it doesn't have a mind. And this somehow seems to be connected with the idea of consciousness. So when you talk about what consciousness is, then you would perhaps begin by saying consciousness is the perception of qualia, it is the perception of some subjective experience. And this might not be propositional. This might be, in some sense, magic, right? It might be some kind of dualist magic. Okay, again, it's nothing that we need to worry about too much in this course. We're talking about AI, but it is something you have to consider when you talk about creating strong AI, because strong AI aims to create a mind and mental states, and therefore strong AI must be able to somehow produce a machine that is able to have qualia. Right? If a machine cannot have qualia, if a machine cannot have subjective content of experience, then the machine does not have a mind similar to ours. And therefore, we don't have strong AI. So strong AI very much depends on what answer we give to the Mary's room argument, whether Mary learned something new or not. If she learned something new, then strong AI is harder to realize, because then we need to put this magic of qualia into the artificial system. If Mary does not learn anything new, then the prospects for strong AI are easier, because then there is no magic. And I can, with engineering, construct a machine that has all the physical properties and the understanding of the qualia that are not mysterious anymore because they're physical facts, right? So for strong AI, this really makes a difference how we perceive Mary's room and how we answer this argument. Okay, that's it for the moment. Thank you, and see you next time.